The sun was setting over the bustling studio lot as the production team of The Steve Harvey Show hurried through their final preparations. It was just another Tuesday for most of the crew, but there was a special energy in the air that evening. Steve Harvey, dressed impeccably in one of his signature suits, sat in his dressing room reviewing his notes for the upcoming show. 10 minutes till we're live, Mr. Harvey, called his assistant through the door. Steve nodded, taking a deep breath. After decades in the entertainment business, he still felt that flutter of excitement before each show. Tonight's guest list included several celebrities, but the one generating the most buzz was Keanu Reeves, who rarely made talk show appearances. "How are you feeling about the Keanu segment?" asked Lisa, his longtime producer, poking her head into the room. "Same as any other interview," Steve replied with a smile, though he had always admired Reeves from afar. There was something about the actor's humble approach to fame that resonated with him. He seems like a genuine soul. Not many of those. Left in Hollywood. Lisa smiled knowingly. "Well, we've got something special planned. Just go with it when the time comes." Before Steve could question her further, she was gone, whisked away by the controlled chaos that preceded every live show. He flipped through his note cards once more, scanning the research his team had compiled on Keanu. The man had experienced his share of tragedy throughout his life, but had somehow maintained a reputation for kindness and generosity that was rare in the industry. Backstage, unknown to Steve, Keanu Reeves had arrived early and was deep in conversation with the show's executive producer. Unlike many celebrities, he had come alone without the usual entourage. He wore simple black jeans and a blazer, his hair slightly longer than it had been during his last film. "So he doesn't know anything about this?" Keanu asked quietly. "Not a thing," confirmed the producer. "We've kept it completely under wraps, just as you requested." Keanu nodded thoughtfully. "I've wanted to do something like this for a while. His story, it really got to me, you know? People see the success now, but they forget the struggle." The floor manager appeared, gesturing urgently. "Places everyone. We're live in 5. The show opened with Steve's usual energetic entrance, the audience rising to their feet with thunderous applause. He moved through the first segment with his characteristic humor and warmth, the viewers at home having no idea that behind the scenes, something unprecedented was being prepared. "When we come back," Steve announced as they headed to commercial, "we're joined by one of Hollywood's most beloved actors, here to talk about his new project. Stay with us." During the break, Steve was approached by Tom, another producer. "Slight change of plans," he said quietly. "We're going to have Keanu come out right after the break, and we've extended his segment by 10 minutes. Steve raised an eyebrow. "Any particular reason?" Tom just smiled. "Trust me on this one." When the show returned, the audience erupted as Keanu Reeves was announced. He walked out with that slightly shy smile that had endeared him to fans worldwide, waving casually to the crowd. Steve rose to greet him with a handshake that turned into a warm hug. "Man, it's good to have you here," Steve said genuinely as they both took their seats. "I gotta tell you, my daughters are going crazy right now knowing I'm talking to you." Keanu laughed softly. "Thank you for having me. I don't do many of these." "I know," Steve nodded. "Which makes us feel all the more special that you chose to come here." The interview began conventionally enough. They discussed Keanu's latest film, a thoughtful drama that was already generating award buzz. Steve's natural ability to make his guests comfortable was on full display, and soon they were chatting like old friends. The audience was captivated by their easy rapport. "You know," Steve said during a natural pause, "I've always admired how you've handled fame. In this business, it's so easy to get caught up in all the glitz and forget what's real, but you've always seemed to keep your feet on the ground." Keanu looked down momentarily, seemingly touched by the comment. "I appreciate that. I think life has a way of teaching us what really matters. The spotlight can be bright, but it's the shadows where we often find our truth." Steve nodded appreciatively, not expecting such a philosophical response. "That's profound, man. That's really profound." What nobody in the audience knew was that backstage, A special package that had arrived earlier that day was being prepared. Inside was something that would change the entire tone of the interview in just a few moments. The conversation continued, touching on Keanu's motorcycle collection, his love of bass guitar, and his thoughts on the changing landscape of cinema. But about 15 minutes in, there was a subtle shift. "Steve," Keanu said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "before we go any further, there's actually something I wanted to talk about, something that not many people know." The studio grew quieter. Even the camera operators sensed that something unexpected was happening. "Back in 1989, Keanu continued, "I was just starting out. I had done a few movies, but nothing had really hit big yet. I was still figuring things out, you know?" Steve nodded, not sure where this was going, but intrigued by the sudden change of direction. There was this comedy club in Los Angeles called the Laugh Factory. One night I went there with a friend, just to get out of the house, clear my head. I was dealing with a lot of rejection at the time, feeling like maybe I wasn't cut out for this business. Steve's eyes widened slightly as recognition began to dawn. There was this comedian performing that night. Keanu continued, his eyes now locked with Steve's. He wasn't the headliner. He was working the tough middle spot, and man, he was having a rough time. The crowd was tough, not giving him much. But he kept going. He didn't give up. The studio was completely silent now. "That
comedian was you, Steve."
A murmur ran through the audience as Steve sat back, genuinely surprised. "Me? You saw me perform back then?" Keanu nodded, a small smile playing across his lips. "I did. And I remember it clearly because something you said that night stuck with me. You were talking about struggle, about how you'd been homeless, living in your car. But you said something like, 'The same sun that melts butter hardens clay.' It's all in how you respond to the heat." Steve's hand moved to cover his mouth, visibly affected by hearing his own words from so long ago. "I was going through a tough time," Keanu continued, "and something about your resilience, your refusal to give up even when the audience wasn't with you. It hit me hard. I went home that night thinking, if this guy can keep going despite everything, so can I." The camera caught Steve swallowing hard, his eyes beginning to glisten under the studio lights. "I never got to thank you for that," Keanu said simply. "But I've followed your journey ever since, from stand-up to sitcoms to game shows, to becoming one of the most beloved television hosts in America. Your story has been a reminder that persistence matters, that keeping your integrity matters." By now, several audience members were wiping away tears, moved by the unexpected vulnerability between these two men. The producers, sensing the powerful moment unfolding, signaled to hold the planned commercial break. "I had no idea," Steve finally said, his voice slightly rough with emotion. "I had absolutely no idea." "Most people don't realize the impact they have on others," Keanu replied. "That's why I wanted to come here today. Not just to talk about my movie, but to close a circle that's been open for over 30 years. The two men sat in a moment of profound connection, the usual talk show banter replaced by something far more authentic. It was the kind of genuine human moment that rarely breaks through the polished surface of television, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something special. What neither the audience nor Steve knew was that this was just the beginning. The real surprise was still waiting in the wings, carefully prepared by Keanu and the production team, ready to unfold in the second half of the show. The emotional journey had only just begun. As the studio audience sat captivated by the unexpected revelation from Keanu, the show's director signaled to the floor manager to hold off on the commercial break. Some moments in television were too precious to interrupt, and this was clearly one of them. Steve leaned forward in his chair, still processing what he'd just heard. "Man, I don't even know what to say. That period of my life was so tough. I was sleeping in my car some nights, showering at gas stations. I was doing gigs for next to nothing just to keep my dream alive." Keanu nodded, his eyes reflecting understanding. That's what made it so powerful. You weren't just telling jokes, you were showing what it means to believe in yourself when nobody else does. A production assistant quietly slipped a tissue to Steve, who dabbed at the corner of his eye. "I appreciate you sharing that story. It's funny how life works, isn't it? You never know who's watching, who you might be touching without even realizing it. Exactly, Keanu agreed. And that's actually why I wanted to do something special today. He glanced off stage, giving a subtle nod to someone just out of frame. Lisa, the producer who had given Steve that cryptic message earlier, stepped forward, handing Keanu a small remote control. "What's going on here?" Steve asked, his famous laugh bubbling up despite his confusion. Keanu smiled that gentle smile that had won over millions of fans. "I've been working with your team on something. With your permission, I'd like to share it with everyone." Steve gestured expansively. "My show is your show, brother." Keanu pressed a button on the remote and the studio lights dimmed slightly. The large screen behind them flickered to life and soft music began to play. The audience gasped as childhood photos of Steve appeared on screen. There he was as a little boy in Cleveland, his wide smile already recognizable despite the decades that had passed. The photos transitioned to his early days as a young man selling insurance, then to his first amateur comedy competitions. A voiceover began, Keanu's distinctive voice, warm and thoughtful. Before he was the Steve Harvey we all know today, he was Broderick Stephen Harvey, a kid from West Virginia who had to fight for everything he got. The images shifted to show Steve in his 20s, standing outside comedy clubs, his clothes noticeably worn but his eyes filled with determination. What most people don't see when they look at success is the struggle that preceded it, Keanu's voice continued. They don't see the nights of doubt, the moments of fear, the times when giving up seemed like the only rational choice. Steve sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the screen, watching his own life story unfold. The audience was equally transfixed, many of them seeing this side of their favorite host for the first time. The video showed newspaper clippings about Steve's early career setbacks, interspersed with footage from his first television appearances. Nervous, raw but undeniably talented. Then came images of him sleeping in his old Ford Tempo, the car that had been his home during his darkest days. In 1989, when I was struggling with my own demons about whether I belonged in Hollywood, I saw this man perform, Keanu narrated as grainy footage played of a much younger Steve on a small comedy club stage. He wasn't famous, he wasn't celebrated, but he had something that couldn't be taught, an unwillingness to be defeated. The footage shifted to Steve's gradual rise, his breakthrough on the Kings of Comedy tour, his first hosting gigs, the success of his radio show, and finally his emergence as one of America's most beloved television personalities. What Steve Harvey has given to all of us goes beyond entertainment, Keanu's voice explained as the music swelled. He's given us a template for perseverance, a living example of what happens when talent meets unbending determination. The screen now showed a montage of Steve's philanthropic work, his mentoring programs for young men without fathers, the scholarships he'd provided, the families he'd helped behind the scenes with no publicity or fanfare. But perhaps what's most remarkable about Steve's journey is that success didn't change his heart, Keanu continued. The man who was once homeless now spends his fortune helping others find their way. The boy who once had nothing now gives everything. The video slowed to show Steve embracing children at his annual mentoring camps, the genuine love on his face impossible to miss. So, today, Keanu's voice concluded, on behalf of all the people you've inspired, those you know about, and those, like me, you never knew were watching, I want to say thank you, Steve Harvey, for showing us that our circumstances don't define us, for reminding us that it's never too late to become what we might have been. The screen faded to black, and the studio lights gradually brightened again. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. The camera panned across the audience to show people openly weeping, deeply moved by what they'd witnessed. When the camera returned to Steve, he was slumped slightly in his chair, tears streaming down his face unashamedly. His usual commanding presence had given way to something more vulnerable, more human. He began, then stopped, overcome. He pulled out his pocket square and wiped his eyes. I don't know what to say. Keanu himself looked emotional. You don't have to say anything. Your life has already said it all. The audience burst into spontaneous applause, rising to their feet in a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. Steve eventually stood too, pulling Keanu into a tight embrace that spoke volumes more than words could express. When the applause finally quieted, Steve returned to his seat, still visibly moved. "You know," he said, his voice slightly hoarse, "in this business you put yourself out there every day. You never know if what you're doing matters, if you're reaching anybody. You just keep going because something inside won't let you quit." He took a deep breath, composing himself. "To hear that something I said during one of the lowest points in my life had an impact on someone like you, man, that's a gift I can't even put into words." Keanu nodded, understanding the weight of the moment. "That's the thing about influence. We never really know the ripple effects of our actions, our words. Sometimes the most important thing we do happens when we think nobody's watching." The director, recognizing the perfect segue, signaled that they needed to break for commercial. Steve, ever the professional, gathered himself. "We're going to take a quick break," he told the camera, his voice still thick with emotion. "But don't go anywhere. We've got more with the incredible Keanu Reeves when we come back." As the on-air light dimmed, signaling they were in commercial, Steve reached over and clasped Keanu's hand firmly. "Thank you," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of decades of struggle and triumph. "Thank you for remembering that guy from all those years ago." Keanu smiled. He was impossible to forget. The floor manager approached, offering them both water and letting them know they had 2 minutes until they were back on air. The audience was still buzzing, many people on their phones, no doubt sharing what they'd just witnessed with friends and family. "I wasn't expecting any of this," Steve admitted quietly to Keanu as they waited. "When did you even have time to put that together?" "I've been working with your team for about 2 months," Keanu replied. "Your wife was in on it too. She provided some of those old photos." Steve shook his head in disbelief. "Marjorie kept this from me? That woman can keep a secret." They both laughed, the tension of the emotional moment breaking slightly. Around them, the crew prepared for the next segment, but there was a different energy now. Something raw and authentic had broken through the polished veneer of daytime television. 30 seconds, called the floor manager. Steve straightened his tie and took a deep breath. "Let's finish this show," he said with renewed composure, though his eyes still shone with emotion. "But Keanu, yes, this moment, what you did today, I'll never forget it. Not ever." The on-air light flickered back on, and just like that they were live again, ready to continue an interview that had transformed from a routine celebrity appearance into something that would be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. The red light on the camera blinked back to life, and the audience, still emotional from the previous segment, welcomed Steve and Keanu back with warm applause. Both men had composed themselves during the break, though the energy in the studio remained charged with genuine emotion. "Welcome back, everybody," Steve said, his voice slightly huskier than usual. "If you're just joining us, well, you missed something pretty special." He chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm sitting here with Keanu Reeves, who just took me on an unexpected trip down memory lane." Keanu smiled, that gentle, slightly shy smile that had become his trademark. "I hope it was okay. I know it was a surprise." "More than okay," Steve assured him, adjusting his position in his chair. "But I gotta ask, what made you decide to do something like this? We've never met before today." The audience grew quiet, leaning forward in their seats to hear Keanu's answer. "That's true," Keanu acknowledged. "But sometimes connection doesn't require physical meeting. Sometimes it's about impact." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "A few years ago, I was going through a period of, let's call it reassessment. I was questioning my path, my choices." Steve nodded encouragingly, giving Keanu space to continue. "I happened to catch an interview where you were talking about your journey, the homelessness, the struggles, the moments when you nearly gave up, and it brought me back to that night at the comedy club." Keanu leaned forward slightly. "You said something in that interview that hit me hard. You said, 'Failure is a great teacher. If you're paying attention, every mistake has a lesson to offer.' I do believe that." Steve confirmed. Well, I was facing some professional disappointments at the time, Keanu continued. And hearing you speak so honestly about failure, coming from someone who's achieved what you have, it gave me perspective. A thoughtful expression crossed Steve's face. It's funny how that works, isn't it? When I was saying those words, I had no idea they might reach someone like you. I was just speaking my truth. That's often when we're most powerful, Keanu observed. When we're just being authentic. The studio audience murmured in agreement. You know, Steve said, I've interviewed thousands of people over the years, but this conversation, this is something different. He turned slightly to address the audience. What Keanu has done here today reminds me of something important. We're all connected in ways we don't always see. He returned his attention to Keanu. But there's something I'm curious about. In that video, you mentioned that you were struggling with your own demons back when you saw me perform. Would you mind sharing a bit about that time in your life? Keanu took a deep breath, and for a moment, the audience wondered if he might deflect the question. He was, after all, known for guarding his privacy. But the authenticity of the moment seemed to open something in him. The late 80s were complicated. For me, he began slowly. I'd had some success with Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, but I was worried about being typecast. I wanted to be taken seriously as an actor, but I kept hearing no at auditions for more dramatic roles. Steve nodded, understanding all too well. Beyond that, Keanu continued, I was dealing with some personal losses, close friends who were gone too soon. A shadow passed briefly over his face. There were nights when I questioned everything. My ability, my place in the industry, whether I was on the right path at all. The studio was absolutely silent now, everyone present aware that they were witnessing a rare moment of openness from a notoriously private star. That night at the comedy club, I went there because I needed to laugh to get out of my own head. I didn't expect to find inspiration. A small smile tugged at his lips. But there you were, turning your pain into something meaningful, making people laugh despite your circumstances. It stuck with me. Steve reached over and placed a hand briefly on Keanu's shoulder. I'm honored that something in my journey spoke to you. That's the beauty of life, isn't it? The unexpected connections. Keanu nodded. Absolutely. And it's why I've tried to pay attention to those moments, to acknowledge the people who've influenced me, even if they don't know it. Is that something you do regularly? Steve asked, genuinely curious. When I can, Keanu replied, though not usually on national television. He smiled, and the audience laughed, the tension breaking slightly. Well, I'm grateful you made an exception in my case, Steve said with a warm chuckle. He glanced at his notes, then set them aside. You know what? I had all these questions prepared about your new movie, but this conversation feels more important. Tell me, what keeps you grounded after all these years in Hollywood? Because man, this industry can mess with your head. Keanu considered the question carefully. I think remembering where I came from helps. My mother raised me with strong values about treating people with dignity, regardless of their position or status. That stays with you. He shifted slightly in his seat. And honestly, I've experienced enough loss in my life to understand what really matters. Fame, money, success, these things are fleeting. But how we treat each other, the impact we have on one another's lives, that's lasting. Steve nodded slowly, visibly moved by Keanu's sincerity. That's profound, man. And it explains a lot about why people respond to you the way they do. There's an authenticity there that can't be faked. I just try to be present, Keanu said simply, to really see the people I interact with. A young woman in the audience raised her hand, and Steve, noticing her, made a spontaneous decision. Looks like someone has a question. Let's hear from our audience. He pointed to her. Go ahead, sweetheart. The woman stood, clearly nervous but determined. First, thank you both for being so open. It's really powerful. She took a deep breath. My question is for both of you. What would you say to someone who's about to give up on their dream because the obstacles seem too great? Steve and Keanu exchanged a look, each silently asking who should answer first. Keanu nodded to Steve, deferring to him. Well, Steve began, I'd say that the darkest hour really is just before dawn. I know that sounds like a greeting card, but I've lived it. The year before my big break, I was at my lowest point, broke, exhausted, questioning everything. If I'd quit then, I wouldn't be sitting here today. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. The problem with giving up is that you'll never know how close you were to breaking through. Success isn't always about talent. Sometimes it's just about outlasting everyone else, about being the last person standing when others have walked away. Keanu nodded in agreement. I'd add that it's important to remember why you started in the first place. Success can be measured in so many ways beyond fame or fortune. Are you still passionate about what you're doing? Does it still bring you joy? Does it allow you to express something true? The woman nodded, taking in their words. And one more thing, Keanu continued. Don't be afraid to redefine your dream as you go. Sometimes the path takes unexpected turns, but those detours often lead to something even better than what you originally imagined. Steve pointed at Keanu. That's wisdom right there, folks. That's pure wisdom. The audience applauded enthusiastically, many of them taking out their phones to record or make notes of what had been said. The woman who'd asked the question mouthed a heartfelt thank you before sitting down. We should probably talk at least a little bit about your new movie before we run out of time, Steve said with a grin. Though I have a feeling this interview is going to be remembered for entirely different reasons. Keanu laughed softly. The movie will find its audience. Some moments are bigger than promotion. True enough, Steve agreed. But tell us a little bit about it. I understand it's something of a departure for you. As Keanu began to describe his latest project, a character-driven drama about redemption and second chances, the cameramen exchanged glances. They'd been in the business long enough to know they were capturing something special, something that transcended the usual celebrity talk show appearance. In the production booth, the executive producer was already fielding calls from network executives who were watching the broadcast live. Yes, we're getting the whole thing, he assured them. Yes, it's completely unscripted. Yes, we'll make sure to get signed releases for the extended footage. Back on stage, Steve and Keanu had seamlessly shifted into a discussion of the craft of acting, both men animated and engaged, their earlier emotional exchange having created a foundation of trust that made their conversation exceptionally genuine. Curie, floor manager, signaled that they had 5 minutes remaining in the segment. So much had happened, yet it felt like they'd barely scratched the surface of what could be said between these two men, from such different worlds, whose paths had crossed in ways neither could have predicted. The floor director made a subtle gesture, indicating they were approaching the final segment of the show. Steve caught the signal and turned slightly in his chair, maintaining the natural flow of conversation. We're running short on time, Steve said, but before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier. He leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. You talked about the importance of acknowledging those who've influenced us. I'm curious, have there been other moments in your life where someone's words or actions changed your path without them knowing? Keanu seemed to consider the question carefully, his gaze drifting momentarily to the studio floor. The audience waited in respectful silence, many still dabbing at eyes that had grown misty during earlier revelations. There have been many, Keanu finally answered, his voice soft but clear. I think about my 9th grade English teacher, who noticed I was struggling with dyslexia but had a passion for stories. Instead of forcing me to read aloud, which was terrifying for me, she'd give me time to prepare passages in advance. A small smile played across his lips. She told me that some of the greatest performers rehearsed the most. That reframed my challenge as preparation rather than limitation. Steve nodded encouragingly. Teachers can make such a difference. Did you ever tell her what that meant to you? I tried to find her years later, Keanu admitted. But she had moved schools, and this was before social media made connections easier. His eyes reflected a gentle regret. That's one reason today felt important to me, because too often these moments of gratitude go unexpressed. A thoughtful murmur rippled through the audience. What about you, Steve? Keanu asked unexpectedly. turning the interview around. Beyond what we've already discussed, who shaped your journey in ways they might not realize? Steve raised his eyebrows, surprised by the question but pleased with the genuine interest behind it. The camera operators subtly adjusted their positions, capturing this unscripted reversal. Man, there are so many, Steve began, settling back slightly. But one that stands out, there was this old comedian named Charlie. I was maybe 24, doing open mics wherever I could get stage time. His eyes grew distant with memory. After one particularly rough set where nobody laughed, and I mean nobody, I was ready to walk away from comedy altogether. The audience leaned forward collectively, drawn into this previously untold story. Charlie caught me in the parking lot as I was leaving. He wasn't famous, just a journeyman comic who'd been doing it for decades. He stopped me and said something I'll never forget. Steve's voice took on a different tone, clearly imitating the older man's cadence. Kid, you're not funny yet, but you will be. You got something that can't be taught. What was that? Keanu asked quietly. Perspective, Steve replied. He told me I saw the world in a way nobody else did, and once I figured out how to translate that vision into words people could understand, I'd be unstoppable. He chuckled softly. I thought he was just being nice to a failing newcomer, but something in how he said it, the certainty in his voice, made me come back the next night, and the night after that. Did Charlie ever see your success? Keanu asked. Steve's expression shifted, a shadow of sadness crossing his features. No. He passed away about a year later. Heart attack backstage at a club in Chicago. He straightened his suit jacket absently. I've often wondered if he had any idea what those few minutes of encouragement in a parking lot would mean for my life. The parallel to Keanu's story, of influence without knowledge, hung in the air between them, creating a profound moment of connection that the audience could feel viscerally. That's beautiful, Keanu said simply. A young production assistant approached from offstage, handing a note to Steve. He glanced at it briefly, then looked up with surprise. Well, this is interesting, Steve said, addressing both Keanu and the audience. Apparently our conversation has been trending online for the past 20 minutes. The network is asking if we'd be willing to extend the segment by another 15 minutes. The audience erupted into enthusiastic applause and cheers, making their opinion on the matter clear. Keanu smiled and nodded his agreement. I think that's a yes, Steve laughed. Let's take a quick commercial break, and we'll be right back with more of this conversation none of us saw coming. As the on-air light dimmed, indicating they were in commercial, the energy in the studio remained electric. Unlike the usual rush during breaks, makeup touch-ups, script consultations, set adjustments, both men remained seated, continuing their conversation even without the cameras rolling. I hope this is okay, Steve said quietly. I know you're not usually one for extended TV appearances. Keanu shook his head reassuringly. This doesn't feel like a television appearance. It feels like a conversation that matters. Across the studio, audience members were busy on their phones, sharing the experience on social media. Video clips of Steve's emotional reaction to Keanu's surprise were already spreading rapidly online, accompanied by comments about authenticity and vulnerability rarely seen on daytime television. In the production booth, phones were ringing continuously as media outlets requested permission to use clips from the broadcast. The show's social media team was struggling to keep up with the explosion of engagement across all platforms. 2 minutes, called the floor director. A makeup artist approached quickly to check both men, but there wasn't much to fix. The slight redness around Steve's eyes from his earlier tears only added to the raw humanity of the moment, something the director had specifically instructed should not be concealed. Are you really okay extending? Steve asked Keanu again. I know you value your privacy. Some conversations deserve the space to unfold properly, Keanu replied, and perhaps this one might help someone else who's watching and struggling, the way you once helped me. Steve nodded, understanding the potential ripple effect of their shared vulnerability. That's a powerful thought. 30 seconds. Came the call. Both men straightened slightly in their chairs, preparing to return to the broadcast while maintaining the genuine connection they'd established. And we're back in 5, 4, 3. The floor director counted down silently with fingers for the final beats, and the red light blinked on once more. Welcome back. Steve greeted the viewing audience warmly. If you're just joining us, I'm having a conversation with Keanu Reeves that took an unexpected turn when he revealed how a chance encounter at a comedy club decades ago impacted his life. He turned to his guest. Keanu, before the break, we were talking about those moments of connection that shape us. I'm wondering, what do you think makes some words or encounters stick with us while others fade away? Keanu considered this thoughtfully. I think timing plays a crucial role, he began. Words that find us when we're at a crossroads tend to carry more weight. When we're vulnerable or searching, we're more receptive to wisdom. He shifted slightly, choosing his next words with care. But I also think it's about recognition. Sometimes, people see something in us that we can't yet see in ourselves. They reflect back a potential or strength we're not fully aware of. The camera caught Steve nodding in agreement, completely engaged. That's what happened that night at the comedy club, Keanu continued. Watching you perform, I recognized something in your struggle that spoke to my own. Your perseverance showed me a path forward when I was feeling lost. It's remarkable to think about these invisible connections between people, Steve observed. The ways we influence each other without even knowing it. Like ripples in water, Keanu agreed. We drop a pebble, a kind word, an act of courage, and have no idea how far the circles might spread. A hand raised in the audience, and Steve, seeing it, made another impromptu decision. Looks like we have another question. He pointed to an older gentleman in the third row. Sir? The man stood, clearly emotional. This isn't really a question, he admitted. More of a thank you. Listening to you both talk about the impact we can have on each other without knowing it. His voice cracked slightly. It's making me think about reaching out to people from my past who changed my life. People I never properly thanked. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the audience. I think that's beautiful, Steve responded. And honestly, that might be the most valuable takeaway from today's conversation. Who in your life needs to hear what they meant to you? Who shaped you in ways they might not even realize? The man nodded gratefully and sat down. Keanu leaned forward, addressing the audience directly, something he rarely did on talk shows. If this conversation inspires even one person to express gratitude that might otherwise have gone unsaid, then today has been worthwhile. Amen to that, Steve agreed fervently. The production assistant appeared again, this time handing Steve a tablet. He looked at it with widened eyes. Well, this is something, he said, sounding genuinely surprised. It seems our conversation has sparked a hashtag that's trending nationally. People are sharing stories of mentors and unexpected influences in their lives, tagging it with a thank you for seeing me. Keanu's expression softened. That's beautiful. It really is, Steve agreed. And it speaks to something universal, doesn't it? We all want to be seen, truly seen, for who we are and what we might become. As their extended segment drew toward its conclusion, there was a sense in the studio that something special had happened. Something that transcended the usual celebrity promotion or entertainment gossip. Two men from different worlds had connected through shared experiences of struggle and perseverance, creating a moment of authenticity that had clearly resonated far beyond the studio walls. We have time for one last question, Steve said, looking at Keanu. What's next for you, not just professionally but personally? Keanu seemed to welcome the question rather than deflect it as he often did in interviews. Professionally, I'm exploring projects that feel meaningful, stories that might help people feel less alone in their struggles. He paused. Personally, I'm trying to be more intentional about connections, about acknowledging the people and moments that matter before the opportunity passes. That sounds like wisdom to me, Steve said softly. And if today is any indication, you're already doing exactly that. As the show's theme music began to play softly in the background, signaling they were approaching the end, Both men seemed reluctant to conclude the conversation, a rarity in the often hurried world of television. "Keanu Reeves, thank you," Steve said finally, his voice rich with sincerity. "Not just for being here today, but for reminding all of us about the power of seeing each other, really seeing each other, across time and circumstance." "Thank you for having me," Keanu replied warmly. "And thank you for that night at the comedy club all those years ago, for showing me what persistence looks like in its rawest form." As they stood to embrace once more, the audience rose spontaneously to their feet, applauding not just the conversation they'd witnessed, but the authentic human connection it represented. A rare and precious thing in a world that often prioritized polish over truth. The applause continued to echo through the studio long after the director had called for the final commercial break. Steve and Keanu remained standing, their handshake having evolved into a genuine embrace that spoke volumes about the connection they'd formed over the course of the show. As they finally separated, both men seemed moved by the moment they had shared. "We're clear for now," called the floor director. "Back in 3 minutes for the closing segment." Rather than heading backstage as guests typically did during the final break, Keanu stayed on set, deep in conversation with Steve. The production crew worked around them, recognizing that something extraordinary was happening, something that deserved space and respect. In the audience, people were wiping away tears, checking social media on their phones, and talking animatedly with one another. A middle-aged woman turned to her companion and whispered, "I've been watching this show for 10 years, and I've never seen anything like this." Her friend nodded in agreement. "It's like we forgot we were watching TV, like we were just listening to two friends talking in a living room." Near the back of the studio, Tom, the executive producer, was engaged in a heated phone call with network executives. "Yes, I understand it went over time," he was saying, "but trust me, this is television gold. The online response is unprecedented. We're getting requests for the full, unedited footage from major outlets." He listened for a moment, then smiled. "Exactly. Authentic human connection, that's what everyone's saying." Another pause. "Yes, we'll make sure to get all the necessary clearances from both sides." Back on stage, the makeup artist approached, hesitantly, not wanting to interrupt the ongoing conversation between host and guest, but needing to do a final touch-up before they went live again. "Sorry to interrupt," she said softly. Steve waved her over with a warm smile. "Do what you need to do, honey. We'll keep talking." As she dabbed lightly at his forehead, Steve turned to Keanu. "You know, after a show like this, I usually head straight home. But I'm wondering if you'd like to continue this conversation somewhere more private? Maybe grab dinner?" Keanu, normally so guarded about his personal time, nodded without hesitation. "I'd like that. There's a lot more I'd like to talk about." "1 minute to air," called the floor director. The makeup artist finished quickly and stepped away. A production assistant rushed over to straighten Steve's tie and brush an invisible speck from Keanu's jacket. The energy in the studio was electric with anticipation for the final segment. "You ready for this?" Steve asked quietly. Keanu gave a small nod. "As ready as I've ever been. And we're live in 5, 4, 3. The silent count finished, and the red light blinked on once more. "Welcome back," Steve said to the camera, his voice carrying the weight of the emotional journey they'd all been on together. "We're in the final moments of what has turned out to be one of the most extraordinary episodes we've ever had on this show." He turned to Keanu. "Before we wrap up, I want to thank you again for the vulnerability and honesty you've brought to our conversation today." Keanu's normally reserved expression had softened considerably. "Thank you for creating a space where that kind of honesty feels possible. That's a rare gift." Steve nodded in acknowledgement. "You know, as we've been talking, I've been thinking about something my grandmother used to tell me. She'd say, 'Stephen, we're all just walking each other home.'" His voice took on a tender quality. What she meant was that life is a journey. We're all on together, and our purpose is to help each other along the way. "That's beautiful," Keanu responded. "And so true. Today's conversation has reminded me of that wisdom," Steve continued. We never know when a word of encouragement or an act of kindness might be exactly what someone else needs to keep going. The camera pulled back slightly to include both men in the frame, capturing the genuine connection between them. I think we've learned something important today, Steve said, addressing both Keanu and the audience. Success isn't just about talent or luck. It's about perseverance. It's about getting back up when life knocks you down. And sometimes it's about being seen by the right person at the right moment. Keanu nodded thoughtfully. And about being open to seeing others in return. About recognizing that beneath our different circumstances and experiences, we're all facing similar struggles, similar doubts. A production assistant approached quietly from stage left, carrying something carefully in her hands. She whispered, briefly to Steve, who smiled and nodded. It seems our team has been busy during the breaks, Steve explained to Keanu and the audience. They found something I think you'll find meaningful. The assistant handed Steve an old, slightly faded photograph. He looked at it for a moment, his expression softening, then passed it to Keanu. What am I looking at? Keanu asked, studying. The image. That's the Laugh Factory in 1989, Steve explained. One of their photographers used to snap pictures of the audience during shows. Our team reached out during the break, and they managed to find this in their archives. Keanu's eyes widened slightly as he examined the photograph more closely. There in the dimly lit audience of the comedy club was a much younger version of himself, long-haired, serious-faced, seated near the back of the room. That's... Keanu began, clearly stunned. That's you, Steve confirmed gently. Watching me bomb on stage all those years ago. A hushed murmur ran through the studio audience as they realized what they were witnessing. Physical proof of the connection that had been formed decades earlier without either man knowing. Keanu held the photograph carefully as if it were a precious artifact. I don't have words. Sometimes life comes full circle in ways we could never anticipate, Steve said, his voice thick with emotion. Sometimes the seeds we plant bear fruit years later, in places we never expected. The camera zoomed in slightly on the photograph, this tangible evidence of their unknowing connection all those years ago, before panning back to capture both men's expressions. I'd like you to keep that, Steve said, gesturing to the photograph, as a reminder of how our paths cross and recross in ways we can't always see. Keanu nodded, clearly moved. Thank you. I will. Steve turned to address the camera directly. We've gone well beyond our usual time today, but sometimes conversations take on a life of their own, and this one felt too important to cut short. He paused, gathering his thoughts. If there's one thing I hope you take away from today's show, it's this. Tell the people who've made a difference in your life what they mean to you. Don't wait. Don't assume they know. Say it while you can. Keanu leaned forward slightly. And pay attention to the impact your own words and actions might have on others. The smallest gesture of kindness or encouragement can change someone's life trajectory in ways you might never see. Exactly right, Steve agreed. He looked at his watch and chuckled softly. Well, folks, we've officially broken every rule in the television handbook today, but sometimes rules need to be broken. The audience laughed appreciatively. Keanu Reeves, Steve said, extending his hand once more. Thank you for making this one of the most memorable days of my career. Keanu took his hand warmly. The honor has been mine, truly. As they stood together for a final moment, the audience rose spontaneously for another standing ovation. Many were openly crying, moved by the authenticity they had witnessed, a rare thing in the often carefully scripted world of television. That's our show for today, Steve said over the applause, his arm now around Keanu's shoulders. But I have a feeling this conversation is just beginning. The theme music swelled, and the cameras began their standard pullback that signaled the end of the broadcast. But instead of the usual quick cut to credits, the director made the unprecedented decision to let the cameras linger, capturing the genuine moment as Steve and Keanu continued talking, oblivious to the fact that they were still being filmed. In the control room, the director spoke quietly into his headset. Stay with them. This is real. This is what television should be. As the credits rolled at the bottom of the screen, viewers at home could still see the two men engaged in earnest conversation, occasionally laughing or nodding in understanding. It was a rare glimpse behind the curtain of celebrity, a moment of genuine human connection that transcended the usual barriers of fame and public persona. Social media was already exploding with clips and quotes from the show. The hashtag "Thank you for seeing me" had spread far beyond the initial viewers, inspiring thousands to reach out to mentors, teachers, friends, and family members who had made a difference in their lives. Outside the studio, a line of cars waited to take various production staff and executives to their next appointments. But in the parking lot behind the building, away from the public eye, 2 folding chairs had been set up next to Steve's car. There in the fading afternoon light, Steve Harvey and Keanu Reeves continued their conversation. No cameras, no audience, no pretense, just 2 men from different worlds, connected by shared experiences of struggle and success, finally able to fully acknowledge the invisible thread that had linked their journeys for decades. And somewhere in the universe, perhaps the cosmic balance shifted just slightly, a reminder that sometimes the most important connections are the ones we never see coming.